October 24, 1944, 06 for 2 hours. Sibuyan Sea, Central Philippines. The horizon burns. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita stands on the bridge of the super battleship Yamato, binoculars pressed against salt-crusted steel, watching his world collapse in real time. Around him, the First Diversion Attack Force, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, 23 warships crowned by the 2 largest battleships he ever built, steams into what should have been a triumphant return to glory. Instead, the sky screams. Wave after wave of American aircraft poured down like locusts, their blue-gray wings blotting out the morning sun. Bombs whistle, torpedoes churn, white wakes through turquoise water. The heavy cruiser Miyake staggers, her bow buried in foam, limping away, trailing oil. Destroyer screens fire uselessly into formations, so dense they seem infinite. Kurita's staff officers exchange glances of mounting horror. The question burning through every man's mind is not if they will be destroyed, but how many carriers could possibly be generating this relentless assault. IJN Action Report. October 1944, translated post-war. The answer defies everything Tokyo believed possible. For months, Japanese Naval Intelligence had tracked American carrier construction with meticulous care. They knew about the Essex-class program. They had even intercepted fragmented reports of new hulls sliding down East Coast shipways, but their analysts dismissed the threat with cold mathematics. Building a fleet carrier, they calculated, required 18 to 24 months minimum. America had lost Lexington, Yorktown, Hornet, and Wasp in 1942, even with industrial might. Washington could not possibly replace those losses and simultaneously expand the fleet to overwhelming superiority. Not by late 1944. 1 year ago, at the Naval General Staff Headquarters in Tokyo, senior planners estimated the U.S. Pacific Fleet might field 8, perhaps 10 carriers by autumn 1944. An aggressive estimate, a worst-case scenario. They built their entire defensive strategy around that number. Japanese Naval War College Assessment. November 1943, U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey translation. They were wrong by a factor that would shatter an empire. Kurita does not yet know the full scope of his miscalculation. But 200 miles east, off the Philippine coast, the truth rides at anchor in Leyte Gulf. 17 fleet carriers, not the pre-war giants like Enterprise or Saratoga, aging survivors held together by weary crews and dockyard miracles. These are Essex-class carriers, the new Brid 8, 172 feet of welded steel, each displacing 27,100 tons, each carrying 90 aircraft, each capable of sustained operations that would have seemed fantastical in 1941. Their names roll like an industrial hymn. Essex, Yorktown II, risen in defiance of the First's grave. Intrepid, Hornet reborn. Franklin, Ticonderoga, Randolph. Lexington likewise resurrected. Bunker Hill, Wasp, another Phoenix. Hancock, Bennington, Bonhomme Richard. Leyte Kasarge, Tarawa Princeton. 17 floating air bases, their flight decks launching coordinated strikes every 90 minutes, grinding the Japanese fleet beneath an aerial avalanche. U.S. Navy Task Force 38 Operations Report, October 1944. How did America do this? Rio to June 1940. Europe burns. France collapses. Britain stands alone. In Washington, President Roosevelt and Navy Secretary Frank Knox stare at war plans projecting a 2-show nightmare. The existing Yorktown-class carriers number only 3. Building more, using traditional methods, custom components, artisan, riveting, iterative design means, years per hull. The Navy needs dozens, and it needs them fast. Enter a quiet revolution. Modular construction, welded hulls, and assembly line logic borrowed from automobile plants. Newport News Shipbuilding, Bethlehem Steel, and the Brooklyn Navy Yard receive contracts for a standardized design. The Essex, not the biggest, not the most innovative, but reproducible engineers at the Bureau of Ships strip away bespoke fluorescence freezing specifications to enable parallel production. Welding replaces riveting, cutting months off construction time. Prefabricated sections, bow assemblies, stern units, island superstructures are built simultaneously across multiple yards, then married together on slipways. Bureau of Ships Technical Bulletin, July 1940. The keel of CV-9, the lead ship Essex, is laid February 28, 1941. She slides into the Atlantic. On July 31, 1942, 17 months later, her sisters follow in a torrent. But keels and hulls mean nothing without propulsion, armor, avionics, and the vast web of suppliers feeding the yards. Here, American industry reveals its true advantage. Westinghouse and General Electric churn out steam turbines, 150,000 shaft horsepower per carrier, enough to push 27,000 tons to 33 knots. Bethlehem Steel rolls armor plate in Pennsylvania. Radio Corporation of America delivers radar sets SK, air search systems with 100-mile range, SM surface search units, and fire control radars that turn the night into a shooting gallery. At Newport News alone, 20,000 workers labor in round-the-clock shifts. Rosie the Riveter is not a metaphor. She is Sarah Kovac, welding on the Intrepid, and Dorothy Miller installing wiring on the Franklin War Production Board Report, 1943. Across America, 500,000 men and women feed the carrier program mining, or in Minnesota, forging steel in Pittsburgh, machining screws in Cleveland, stitching life vests in North Carolina, Tokyo. Meanwhile, builds Taiyu and Shinano, marvels of engineering armored flight decks, pressurized hangars, elegant design. They take years. Taiyu launches in April 1943, sinks in June 1944 from a single submarine torpedo that ignites fuel vapors. Shinano, converted from a Yamato-class battleship hull, requires 4 years and is torpedoed 10 days after commissioning. Japan completes 2 large fleet carriers between 1942 and 1945. America completes 17 Essex-class carriers plus dozens of light carriers and escort carriers, and the same span Japanese naval construction records. Post-war analysis. The psychological gap mirrors the industrial one. Japanese doctrine in 1941 revered the carrier as a decisive weapon, but a finite one. Carriers were precious, irreplaceable queens on a chessboard. Lose one, and the fleet's balance tilts. Lose 3 or 4, and strategy collapses. American doctrine, by contrast, treats carriers as expendable in aggregate, not individually. Crews fight savagely to save damaged ships, but strategically. If Task Force 38 loses 2 carriers and the enemy loses 1, America wins, because Newport News will deliver 3 more next quarter. Admiral Chester Nimitz operates with this calculus embedded in every offensive plan. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, grasps the imbalance by mid-1942, but cannot alter Japan's industrial base. Steel production. US 90 million tons in 1943, Japan 7.8 million. Oil imports. US secure, Japan strangled by submarine blockade. US Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. The war is decided in the factories before it is decided on the waves. Back in the Sibian Sea, Kurita counts the strikes. 5th wave, 6th wave, 7th. His flagship Yamato shudders underneath her 18.1-inch guns, uses against targets 4 miles overhead. The super battleship Musashi, her sister, absorbs 19 torpedo hits and 17 bombs across 5 hours. She capsizes at 1935 hours, taking 1,023 men into the depths. IJN, damage reports, Battle of Leyte Gulf. Kurita reverses course twice, paralyzed by the sheer weight of American aviation. He does not yet know the full count. He does not know that arrayed against him are not 8 carriers, not 10, but a floating armada whose mere existence represents an industrial miracle Tokyo never imagined possible. The secret was not a secret at all. It was hiding in plain sight, published in Jane's fighting ships, announced in Navy Department press releases, photographed by newsreel cameras at launching ceremonies, where champagne bottles shattered against bows and brass bands played. The Essex-class carriers were no mystery. What Japanese intelligence failed to grasp was not the existence of the program, but the speed and scale of its execution and the operational revolution it enabled. While Tokyo's analysts tallied holes, they missed the infrastructure beneath, the coordination systems, the logistical networks, the doctrinal innovations that transformed 17 carriers from a fleet into a machine. At the heart of this transformation sat a technology so mundane that Imperial Navy officers barely considered it. The FM radio, not the long-range, high-frequency sets used for ship-to-shore communication, but compact, very high-frequency radios operating between 100 and 156 MHz, instantaneous, immune to the static and fading that plagued HF transmissions. Motorola and RCA delivered thousands of these sets, installed not just on carriers but on destroyers, cruisers, supply ships, and inside every strike aircraft technical manual TM11 to 480. U.S. Navy VHF radio equipment, 1943. The result, Task Force 38 operated as a single networked organism. Strike coordinators aboard Lexington could redirect bombers from Essex mid-flight to targets spotted by scouts from Intrepid. Damage control teams on one carrier radioed solutions to another carrier under attack. Fighter directors scrambled Hellcats from 4 different flight decks against a single incoming raid, merging them into coordinated intercepts with overlapping fields of fire. The Japanese had radios too, but their sets were heavier, less reliable, prone to jamming, and their doctrine emphasized radio silence to avoid detection. They coordinated strikes using pre-briefed plans and visual signals. Against the fluid real-time choreography enabled by American FM nets, Japanese formations arrived piecemeal, uncoordinated, and were slaughtered. U.S. Navy Electronics Warfare Report, 1944. Pair the radios with radar, and the advantage became insurmountable. Every Essex-class carrier mounted an SK air search radar with a 100-mile detection range, sweeping the sky in a continuous 360-degree scan. SM surface search radars tracked ships to the horizon. Fighter directors sat in the carrier air group headquarters, watching blips crawl across cathode ray tubes, vectoring Hellcat patrols toward threats with clinical precision. Bogies bearing 275, Angels 15, range 60 miles, Vector 280, Buster. The Hellcats turned west, throttles open, climbing through 15,000 feet to intercept Japanese strike packages before they reached the fleet. No guesswork, no luck. Mathematics and Electrons Radar Operators Manual, Model SK, Bureau of Ships, 1943. Japanese pilots, accustomed to surprising enemy fleets, now found themselves ambushed 50 miles out by fighters that seemed to materialize from empty sky. Dramatized composite from post-war interrogations. We believed we were approaching undetected. Suddenly, American fighters dove from above and behind. They knew exactly where we were. We never reached the carriers, but radios and radar were force multipliers useless without the force itself. And here, the Essex-class design revealed its genius. Each carrier's air wing comprised 90 aircraft, 36 F-6F Hellcat fighters, 36 SB-2C Helldiver dive bombers, 18 TBF Avenger torpedo bombers, multiplied by 17 carriers, 1,530 aircraft, not counting the dozens more carried by light carriers and escort carriers in supporting task groups. U.S. Navy Aircraft Allocation Tables. 3rd Fleet, October 1944. The Hellcat built by Grumman in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania was not the fastest fighter in the Pacific. The Japanese A6M0 could outturn it at low speeds, but the F6F was faster in a dive. Heavier armed, 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns, 2,400 rounds total, and could absorb punishment that shredded Zeros. Hellcat pilots flew with an industrial safety net. If shot down, rescue submarines and destroyers prowled nearby. Japanese pilots, once lost, were gone forever. Japan's elite carrier aviators, men who bombed Pearl Harbor, sank the Lexington, fought at Coral Sea, were irreplaceable. America trained 60,000 naval aviators between 1942 and 1945, funneling them through Pensacola, Corpus Christi, and Jacksonville in an assembly line that mirrored the shipyard's Naval Aviation Training Command report. 1945, Lose, I Squadron, and a replacement squadron arrived within weeks. The logistics undergirding this armada staggered comprehension. Each Essex-class carrier consumed 120,000 gallons of fuel oil per day at cruising speed, more during flight operations. They required fresh water, munitions, spare parts, food for 3,400-man crews. The U.S. Navy solved this with the fleet train floating supply depots and underway replenishment vessels that transformed the Pacific into a mobile war base. Oilers like Guadalupe and Housatonic pulled alongside carriers at sea, pumping fuel through hoses at 8 knots, while both ships steamed in parallel. Ammunition ships transferred bombs, torpedoes, and .50 cal belts using highline. Refrigerated supply ships delivered frozen beef, vegetables, and ice cream. 2 carriers 5,000 miles from San Francisco. Service Squadron 10 Operations Manual, 1944. Japanese logistics, by contrast, collapsed. Oilers became priority targets for American submarines. By late 1944, Japanese carriers at anchor in Brunei couldn't sortie without risking fuel exhaustion. Admiral G. Saburo Ozawa's mobile fleet, at the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June, carried half-trained pilots and partial fuel loads. Vice Admiral Kurita's center force at Leyte was ordered to sortie knowing it lacked fuel for a return. Voyager, one-way mission. Japanese Naval Operations Records, post-war interrogation, October 25, 1944, 0645 hours. Off Samar Island, northern Philippines, Kurita's center force, having survived the Sibuyan Sea mauling, emerges from San Bernardino Strait into the Philippine Sea. Ahead lies Leyte Gulf, American invasion fleet, hundreds of transports and supply ships, vulnerable. Between Kurita and his targets, Taffy 3, a tiny escort carrier, Group 6 Casablanca-class, jeep carriers, and 7 destroyers. Escort carriers are not Essex-class Japanese. They're 10,000-ton conversions of merchant hulls, carrying 28 aircraft each, capable of 19 knots maximum. Kurita commands 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 11 destroyers. His guns outranged Taffy 3 by 20 miles. His shells weigh 3,200 pounds. It should be a massacre. It becomes a legend. Admiral Clifton Sprague, commanding Taffy 3 from the carrier Fanshawe Bay, orders his jeep carriers to launch everything fighters with anti-personnel bombs, torpedo bombers without torpedoes, anything that can fly. He orders his destroyers to attack, not to screen, to attack. Destroyers Fletcher-class, 2,100 tons, 5-inch guns charge battleships, displacing 35,000 tons. The destroyer Johnston, Lieutenant Commander Ernest Evans, commanding, races directly at the Japanese line at 35 knots, firing 200 rounds from her 5-inch guns, then launching 10 torpedoes at 10,000 yards. 1 torpedo strikes the heavy cruiser Kumano, blowing off her bow. Japanese battleships turn to evade the torpedo spreads, breaking formation. Johnston vanishes into rain squalls, her hull shredded by 14-inch shells, but she survives another 2 hours. Dueling cruisers at point-blank range, USS Johnston Action Report. October 25, 1944, posthumous reconstruction from survivors. The destroyer hull absorbs 40 hits before sinking. The destroyer escort, Samuel B. Roberts a tin can, 1/5 the size of a cruiser, closes to 4,000 yards and trades salvos with battleship Congo until her magazines explode. Above, Taffy 3's aircraft swarm the Japanese fleet in desperation attacks. FM-2 2 Wildcats strafe pagoda superstructures with .50 cals, forcing gunners to take cover. TBF Avengers make dry torpedo runs, no torpedoes aboard, just the threat causing battleships to maneuver and lose speed. Pilots land on Fanshawe Bay, rearm with whatever ordnance remains, and launch again. Some make for sorties. 1 Wildcat pilot, out of ammunition, makes repeated dummy runs, diving at bridge windows until anti-aircraft fire drives him off Taffy 3 Airgroup. After action report. October 1944. Radio transmissions crackle across FM nets to other Taffy groups, to the distant fast carrier task forces. Within minutes, Essex-class carriers 300 miles away launch strikes toward Samar. Kurita's radio operators report the intercepts. Large carrier formations inbound. Kurita hesitates. His cruisers are scattered, chasing individual jeep carriers. His battleships have expended hundreds of shells against destroyers. He believes he is facing fleet carriers. The air attacks feel too heavy, too coordinated for escort carriers. His staff reports intercepted transmissions, suggesting Task Force 38 is approaching. At 0911 hours, after 2.5 hours of battle, with Taffy 3's jeep carriers dead in the water and his victory minutes away, Kurita orders a retreat. He turns north, then west, withdrawing through San Bernardino Strait. IJN, Center Force War Diary. October 25, 1944. Translated post. He does not know he is fleeing from escort carriers and destroyers. He does not know the transmissions were from distant strikes, still an hour away. He only knows that American air power is limitless, that every minute risks annihilation from carrier planes he cannot see but assumes are overhead. Taffy. 3 loses to escort carriers, 2 destroyers, 1 destroyer escort. Kurita loses 3 heavy cruisers and retreats, with the most powerful surface fleet Japan will ever assemble again. The battle is decided not. The waves did not stop at Leyte Gulf. They rolled westward across the Pacific, through the winter of 1944 and into the spring of 1945. An unrelenting tide of steel and aviation fuel. Task Force 38 became Task Force 58, reshuffled and reinforced, but the operational tempo never slackened. The Essex-class carriers, some scarred by kamikaze hits, others fresh from shakedown cruises, maintained a rhythm that ground Japanese defenses into dust. Every 72 hours, the cycle repeated: steam toward the target, launch pre-dawn strikes, recover aircraft, refuel at sea, steam toward the next target, Formosa, Luzon, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, the Japanese home islands themselves. Admirals Nimitz and Halsey wielded the carrier fleet like a sword with 17 edges, slashing at airfields, ports, shipping, and infrastructure with a consistency that transformed strategic bombing into industrial. Routine U.S. Pacific Fleet Operations Plan 14-44, December 1944. The psychological impact on Japanese forces metastasized from shock into fatalism. Intercepted communications and post-war interrogations revealed a collapse in morale that statistics alone could not capture. A Japanese army colonel stationed on Luzon wrote in his diary, February 1945, "The enemy's aircraft darken the sky from dawn until dusk. Our own air force has vanished. We are told reinforcements are coming. No one believes this anymore." U.S. Army Military Intelligence Service translation. Captured documents. Luzon campaign. Naval aviators, the few who survived, reported similar despair. A Zero pilot interrogated after capture on Okinawa described the American carrier fleet in terms bordering on supernatural. "We were taught that carriers were vulnerable, that a determined strike could cripple them, but they are always there, always launching, always attacking. Sink one and two more appear. It is like fighting the ocean." U.S. Navy Intelligence Interrogation Report, May 1945. This was not propaganda. This was the rational assessment of men who had watched their comrades fly into a meat grinder, mission after mission, with no hope of altering the outcome. The engineering and human labor sustaining this operational tempo deserves recognition as much as the battles themselves. Each Essex-class carrier returned to Leyte Atoll or Pearl Harbor every 6 to 8 weeks for replenishment and maintenance. Repair ships and floating dry docks swarmed the hulls. Machinists from the USS Vestal, the repair ship that had survived Pearl Harbor, welded steel plates over kamikaze damage, replacing flight deck sections in 72-hour marathons. Aviation mechanics enlisted men. Many teenagers tore down radial engines on Hellcats and Avengers, replacing cylinders, magnetos, and fuel pumps under floodlights through the night. Ordnancemen loaded 500-pound bombs and torpedoes from ammunition lighters, stacking them in magazines with millimeter precision because a single mistake meant catastrophic explosion. Bureau of Ships War Damage Report No. 57. USS Franklin, March 1945. These men rarely appear in histories, but without them, the carriers were inert monuments. Their contribution was not glamorous. It was exhausting, dangerous, and relentless, and it kept 17 carriers operational when a single week of maintenance failure could have crippled the fleet. The strategic impact rippled beyond the Pacific. In Washington, the Joint Chiefs of Staff analyzed the carrier offensive and drew doctrinal conclusions that would shape American military policy for 70 years. The Essex-class program validated a new theory of war: mass production as force multiplication. Quantity, when paired with quality and coordinated through superior logistics and communications, became its own form of supremacy. This was not attrition warfare in the World War I sense, where millions died for marginal gains. This was industrial overmatch, deploying resources so overwhelming that the enemy's strategic options collapsed before battles were fought. General George Marshall remarked in a post-war briefing, "The Japanese fought with courage and skill, but they fought a 1930s war with 1930s production. We fought a 1940s war with 1950s production." U.S. Army Chief of Staff Strategic Assessment, November 1945. The lesson embedded itself in American defense planning. During the Cold War, the U.S. Navy built Forrestal-class and Nimitz-class super, larger and more capable than the Essex-class, but always in numbers 10-12. Eventually 15 nuclear-powered carriers, enough to project power in multiple theaters simultaneously. The doctrine, born at Leyte Gulf, that America wins by outbuilding, outsupplying, and outcoordinating, became unshakable orthodoxy, yet the human cost shadowed the triumph. The Essex-class carriers were not invulnerable. On March 19, 1945, the USS Franklin, operating 50 miles off Japan, took 2 direct hits from a Japanese dive bomber. Bombs penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the hangar bay among armed and fueled aircraft. Secondary explosions ripped through the ship. Gasoline fires incinerated flight crews. The forward elevator 40-ton steel platform was blown 400 feet into the air and landed on the flight deck, crushing men beneath. 724 sailors died, 265 were wounded. Franklin listed, dead in the water, smoke pouring from her hull. Her crew, those who survived, fought fires for 3 hours, jury-rigged propulsion, and nursed the carrier 12,000 miles back to New York under her own power. The most heavily damaged carrier to survive the war. USS Franklin War Damage Report. Bureau of Ships, April 1945. The Bunker Hill, hit by 2 kamikazes off Okinawa. On May 11, 1945, lost 389 men. The Intrepid was hit 5 times by kamikazes across 2 years, earning the nickname Evil Eye from Japanese pilots who considered her cursed. Each time, she returned to action. The carriers were tough, but the men inside them bled. Japanese strategy, by early 1945, devolved into suicide. The kamikaze program, born from desperation, aimed to exploit the one vulnerability American industry could not eliminate: human bodies. A Zero loaded with explosives and flown into a carrier could kill hundreds, damage flight decks, and temporarily reduce American striking power. Admiral Tokijiro Onishi, architect of the Kamikaze Corps, believed that if Japan could inflict enough pain, sink enough carriers, kill enough sailors, American public opinion would fracture and negotiate a conditional peace. Japanese Naval General Staff Memorandum, October 1944, translated post. The mathematics were coldly logical from Tokyo's perspective. Trade 1 pilot and 1 plane for 1 carrier, and even America's industrial base couldn't sustain the losses. But the mathematics were wrong. Kamikazes sank no Essex-class carriers. They damaged many, killed thousands, but the hulls were too tough, the damage control too competent, the replacements too plentiful. For every carrier knocked out for repairs, another arrived from Norfolk or Bremerton. The kamikazes inflicted tragedy, but they did not alter the trajectory of the war. They only confirmed, in the most horrific terms, that Japan had run out of options except death. US Strategic Bombing Survey. Interrogations of Japanese officials, 1946. By July 1945, the Essex-class carriers steamed within sight of Tokyo Bay, launching strikes on the Japanese home islands with impunity. American submarines had strangled Japanese oil imports. B-29 bombers based in the Marianas firebombed cities nightly. The Soviet Union prepared to invade Manchuria. The atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6 and 9, delivered by B-29s, but the strategic isolation that made Japan's position untenable had been forged, in large part, by carrier aviation. On August 15, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. On September 2, aboard the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay, representatives of the Japanese government signed the instrument of surrender. Overhead, 450 carrier aircraft flew in formation. Hellcats, Corsairs, Avengers launched from Essex-class carriers anchored in the bay. It was a final demonstration, deliberate and theatrical, of the force that had brought the empire to its knees. U.S. Navy official photographs. Tokyo Bay, September 2, 1945. The post-war reckoning confirmed what Kurita had sensed in the Sibuyan Sea. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, interviewing Japanese military officials in 1946, documented the perception gap that doomed Japanese strategy. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, chief of the Naval General Staff, stated bluntly, "We calculated that your production capacity would peak at 10 fleet carriers by 1944, when 17 appeared at Leyte. We understood that our intelligence had failed catastrophically, and with it, our strategy. USSB. Interrogation of Admiral Toyoda, January 1946. Japanese planners had fought the war they expected: a war of finite resources, decisive battles, and attrition balances. America fought the war. It built a war of infinite replenishment, distributed lethality, and systemic endurance. The Essex-class carriers were not wonder weapons. They were the physical manifestation of a philosophy: win by making victory inevitable through sheer, sustained, overwhelming output. The legacy extended beyond victory. Of the 24 Essex-class carriers completed during and immediately after the war, many served into the jet age. The Ariscani launched F-8 Crusaders over Vietnam in 1965. The Lexington trained naval aviators until 1991, 49 years after her commissioning. Some were rebuilt with angled flight decks and steam catapults, serving as attack carriers through the Cold War. Others became anti-submarine carriers, helicopter platforms, or museum ships: the Intrepid in New York, the Hornet in San Francisco, the Yorktown in Charleston's Highland monuments to a moment when America's industrial engine turned warfare into production, and production into